Eleanor Chen never imagined that playing piano at a charity event would change her entire life. She was 32 years old, living in a small apartment in Seattle and teaching piano to kids after school. Money was always tight, but she loved what she did. Music was her whole world. Every note she played came from somewhere deep inside her heart. The charity gala that evening was at one of Seattle's fanciest hotels. Eleanor had been hired to play background music during dinner. She wore a simple black dress she had borrowed from her roommate and felt completely out of place among all the wealthy guests in their designer gowns and expensive suits. But the moment she sat down at the grand piano, all her nervousness disappeared. Her fingers touched the keys and she forgot about everything else. She was playing a piece by Chopin when she noticed an older gentleman standing near the piano. He wasn't mingling with the other guests. He was just listening, really listening, with his eyes closed. When she finished, he opened his eyes and smiled at her. There was something kind about his face, something genuine that she rarely saw in places like this. During her break, the man approached her. His name was Richard Ashford, and he was 68 years old. Eleanor had heard the name before. Everyone in Seattle knew about the Ashford family. They owned factories and businesses all over the country. Richard was worth billions. But talking to him, you would never know it. He asked her about the music, about her favorite composers, about why she loved teaching. They talked for over an hour, and Eleanor found herself laughing and sharing stories like she was talking to an old friend. Before the night ended, Richard asked if he could take her to dinner sometime. Eleanor hesitated. She could see the age difference. She knew what people would think. But there was something about Richard that drew her in. He was lonely, she could see that. And despite all his money, he seemed like someone who just wanted a real connection with another person. Their first dinner turned into a second, then a third. Richard took her to quiet restaurants where they could talk for hours. He told her about his late wife, Catherine, who had died 5 years earlier. She had loved music too. He told her about his 3 grown children who were always too busy for him. He said he had everything money could buy, but he missed having someone to share simple moments with. Eleanor told him about growing up in a working-class family, about her parents who had sacrificed everything so she could study music. She told him about her small dreams of maybe opening her own music school someday. Richard listened to everything like it was the most important thing in the world. 6 months went by like a beautiful dream. Richard was nothing like the stuffy rich men Eleanor had imagined billionaires to be. He loved walking in the rain, browsing old bookstores and listening to her practice piano in her tiny apartment. He said her playing reminded him of his wife, and it made him feel alive again after years of just going through the motions. When Richard proposed, Eleanor cried. She knew what this meant. She knew his children would hate her. She knew the whole world would call her a gold digger. But she also knew that she genuinely loved this man. He had become her best friend, her confidant, the person who understood her better than anyone else ever had. They married in a small ceremony with just a few close friends. Richard had wanted to invite his children, but they refused to come. His oldest son, Theodore, had called her terrible names over the phone. His daughter, Patricia, had sent a cold email saying she wanted nothing to do with the wedding. His youngest son, Benjamin, had simply stopped answering his father's calls. Eleanor tried not to let it hurt her, but it did. She had hoped they would see that she truly cared for their father. She had even signed a prenuptial agreement without Richard asking, telling him she didn't want his money, just him. But the children never gave her a chance. They saw the age gap and decided she was a villain in their story. The 8 months that followed were the happiest of Eleanor's life, and probably Richard's too. They traveled to small towns instead of fancy resorts. Richard came to her music school and watched her teach, his eyes full of pride. Eleanor helped him sort through old family photos and listened to his stories. She could see how much he missed his children, and she encouraged him to keep trying to reach out to them. But every attempt was met with silence or hostility. Richard's health had never been perfect.
He had a heart condition that he managed with medication.
The doctors had told him to slow down to avoid stress. Eleanor made sure he took his pills, cooked healthy meals, and tried to keep his life peaceful. But she couldn't control everything. One Tuesday morning, Richard left for a business trip to New York. It was supposed to be just 3 days. He kissed Eleanor goodbye and promised to call her that night. She reminded him about his medication and he laughed, saying she worried too much. The call came at 2 in the morning. Eleanor was already awake, unable to sleep because something felt wrong. A hospital administrator told her that Richard had collapsed in his hotel room. Massive heart attack. He was gone before the ambulance even arrived. Eleanor's world shattered. She flew to New York in a daze, but by the time she arrived, Richard's children had already taken control of everything. They wouldn't let her see his body. They planned the funeral without her input. Theodore looked at her with pure hatred and told her she wasn't welcome at the service. She went anyway. She sat in the back of the church alone, while hundreds of people who barely knew Richard filled the front rows. His children gave speeches about what a wonderful father he had been, and Eleanor wanted to scream. Where were they when he was alive and lonely? Where were they when he called them every week, hoping just to hear their voices? After the funeral, Richard's lawyer, a dignified older man named Gerald Pemberton, pulled her aside. He said the will reading would be in 2 weeks at the family mansion. He told her she had to be there. It was legally required. Eleanor didn't want to go. She knew it would be awful, but she owed it to Richard to see his final wishes through. Those 2 weeks were the loneliest of Eleanor's life. She moved through her days like a ghost. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't even play piano. The one time she tried, she broke down crying after just a few notes. Her friends tried to comfort her, but no one understood. They had all warned her about marrying someone so much older, about getting hurt. But this wasn't about age or money. She had lost the person who understood her soul. The day of the will reading arrived gray and cold. Eleanor put on a simple black dress and drove to the Ashford mansion. She had only been there once before, when Richard had wanted to show her the home where he had raised his children. Now it felt like enemy territory. She parked her car and sat there for a long moment, trying to gather her courage. Through the large windows, she could see people moving inside. Richard's children, their spouses, lawyers, all of them waiting. All of them probably hoping she would just disappear. Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would face it with dignity. She would honor Richard's memory, even if his family never understood what they had really shared. She walked toward the front door, her heart pounding, having no idea that everything she thought she knew was about to change. The butler opened the door before Eleanor could even knock. He was an elderly man who had worked for the Ashford family for decades. He gave her a small, sympathetic nod but said nothing. Even he could feel the tension in the air. Eleanor stepped inside the grand entrance hall. The mansion was exactly as she remembered it. High ceilings, marble floors, expensive artwork on every wall. But it felt cold now, empty despite all the people gathered inside. She could hear voices coming from Richard's study down the hall. Angry voices. She walked slowly toward the study, her shoes clicking on the marble. With each step, her stomach twisted tighter. Part of her wanted to turn around and leave. But she had promised Richard she would always be brave, even when things got hard. When she entered the study, every conversation stopped. All eyes turned to her. The room was full of people. Richard's 3 children sat in the front row of chairs facing the massive desk. Theodore, the oldest, was 42 and looked just like his father, except his eyes were hard and cold. Patricia, the middle child at 39, wore a designer black suit and had her arms crossed. Benjamin, the youngest at 35, wouldn't even look at Eleanor. He just stared at the floor. Behind them sat their spouses, a few family friends, and several lawyers in expensive suits. And behind the desk sat Gerald Pemberton, Richard's attorney for over 40 years. He was the only person in the room who didn't look at Eleanor with hatred or suspicion. He gestured to an empty chair in the back corner. Eleanor moved to the chair, feeling like everyone was watching her every move. As she sat down, Patricia leaned over to Theodore and whispered something. Theodore's jaw clenched. Eleanor heard Patricia's words clearly. "I can't believe she actually showed up." The nerve. Eleanor's hands shook. She folded them in her lap and tried to breathe normally. She wanted to defend herself, to tell them she loved their father, that she had made his last months happy. But what was the point? They had already decided who she was. Gerald cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Now that everyone is here, we can begin. I know this is difficult for all of you. Richard was a dear friend of mine, and his loss is deeply felt," Theodore interrupted. "Let's just get this over with, Gerald. We all know why we're here." Gerald gave him a long look, then opened a leather folder. "Very well. I'll read the last will and testament of Richard Joseph Ashford, signed and witnessed 6 months ago. 6 months ago. That was just before Richard married Eleanor. She saw Patricia and Theodore exchange a meaningful glance. They probably thought Richard had changed everything after meeting her. Gerald began reading the legal language, the formal words that turned a person's final wishes into reality. Eleanor tried to focus, but her mind kept drifting. She remembered Richard in this very room, sitting behind that desk, laughing at something she had said. He used to say this study was his favorite place in the house because it had the best view of the garden. Gerald's voice brought her back. To my son Theodore, I leave $10 million in trust along with my 50% share in Ashford Industries, ensuring he can continue leading the company we built together. To my daughter Patricia, I leave $10 million in trust along with the property in London that she has always admired. To my son Benjamin, I leave $10 million in trust along with my collection of rare books which I hope he will finally take time to read. The room was quiet. Eleanor felt a small relief. Richard had taken care of his children. They would never want for anything. Maybe now they would understand that Richard hadn't abandoned them. But Gerald wasn't finished. To each of my 5 grandchildren, I leave $2 million in trust, to be accessed when they turn 25. Patricia uncrossed her arms slightly. Benjamin finally looked up. Even Theodore's expression softened just a bit. It was a generous will. Richard had made sure his entire family was secure for generations. Then Gerald turned a page and his voice became more serious. To my wife, Eleanor Chen Ashford, I leave the family estate in the Hamptons along with all its contents, including my complete art collection. Additionally, I leave her the apartment in Manhattan and full access to my personal bank accounts. The room exploded. Theodore shot to his feet. Absolutely not. This is insane. Patricia's face turned red. She was married to him for 8 months. 8 months. And she gets the Hampton estate? Benjamin stood up too, his voice shaking. That estate has been in our family for 3 generations. Our mother loved that place. Our grandmother died there. And he gives it to some stranger? Eleanor felt like she couldn't breathe. The Hampton estate was worth at least $50 million. The art collection was worth millions more. She had no idea Richard had left her anything, let alone something so valuable. Gerald raised his hand, trying to restore order. Please, everyone sit down. I understand this is emotional, but there's more you need to hear. More? Theodore's voice was sharp as a knife. What more could there possibly be? It's obvious what happened here. She manipulated him. She waited until he was vulnerable and lonely, and she convinced him to change his will. He turned to Eleanor, pointing at her. You're a con artist, a gold digger. You saw an old man with money and you swooped in. Did you even love him, or was it all an act? Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She met Theodore's angry gaze and said nothing. What could she say that would make any difference? Patricia stood up again. We're contesting this will, Gerald. We'll prove undue influence. No court will allow this to stand. She isolated him from his family, poisoned his mind against us, and manipulated him into giving her everything. Your father was of sound mind, Gerald said firmly. I spoke with him at length when he made these changes. He knew exactly what he was doing. Then he was being controlled. Patricia shot back. She must have threatened him or lied to him about us or something. Our father would never do this. Benjamin's wife spoke up for the first time. How long were you planning this, Eleanor? Did you target him specifically? Did you research rich widowers and decide Richard was your best option? The accusations kept coming, each one more painful than the last. Eleanor sat frozen in her chair. She wanted to run out of the room, out of the house, away from all this hatred, but her body wouldn't move. Gerald stood up, his voice cutting through the chaos. Enough, all of you, sit down right now. Something in his tone made everyone stop. Gerald had been a quiet, polite man for as long as anyone had known him. But now his eyes flashed with anger. You should all be ashamed of yourselves, he said quietly. Your father is barely in the ground and you're fighting over money like vultures. This isn't about money, Theodore said. This is about protecting our father's legacy from someone who never cared about him. Gerald picked up another envelope from his desk. Is that what you think? Then you didn't know your father at all in his final years, and that's exactly why we're in this situation. He held up the envelope. Before anyone says another word, before any more accusations are thrown around, I have something Richard specifically instructed me to share at this exact moment. Patricia frowned. What is it? A letter, Gerald said. From your father. To the three of you. He wrote it 2 weeks before he died, and he asked me to read it aloud after the will, knowing exactly what your reaction would be. The room went completely silent. Even Theodore sat back down. Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. Gerald carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. His hands were steady, but his voice was thick with emotion as he began to read. My dear children, Gerald read, if you're hearing this letter, then I am gone and you are angry. I know you well enough to predict your reaction to my will. You believe Eleanor married me for money. You think she manipulated me. You're probably already planning to contest everything and drag her through court. Eleanor closed her eyes. Even from beyond the grave, Richard knew his children perfectly. Gerald continued, I need you to understand something. Eleanor gave me life when I was simply existing. After your mother died, I was lost. You were all too busy with your own lives to notice, and I don't blame you for that. You have your own families, your own problems, but I was drowning in loneliness. Benjamin's face crumpled. Patricia looked away. Eleanor asked for nothing, Gerald read. She loved me for who I was, not what I had. She made me laugh again. She held my hand during the scary doctor visits you didn't know about. She listened to my old stories like they mattered. She gave me 8 months of happiness I never thought I'd feel again. Theodore's expression hadn't changed, but his hands gripped the armrests of his chair. But I know words won't convince you, the letter continued. You've already made up your minds. So I've prepared something else, something that will show you the truth about who Eleanor really is. Gerald looked up from the letter. Richard left specific instructions for this moment. Before any further discussion about the estate, before any legal action is considered, there is one more thing that must happen. What thing? Patricia asked, her voice uncertain now. Gerald looked directly at Eleanor. Eleanor, would you please come forward? Eleanor stood on shaking legs and walked to the front of the room. She had no idea what was happening. Richard had never mentioned any of this to her. Gerald gestured toward the corner of the study. There, partially covered by a sheet, sat Richard's prized possession. His grandmother's Steinway grand piano, over 100 years old and worth a fortune. Richard's instructions are clear, Gerald said. Eleanor, you are to play a specific piece on this piano. Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor. It was Catherine's favorite piece. The room erupted again with protests, but Eleanor barely heard them. She stared at the piano, her mind reeling. Richard's first wife, Catherine, had been an accomplished pianist. This had been her piano. And this piece, this incredibly difficult and emotional piece, had been the one Catherine played at her final recital before she got sick. This is ridiculous, Theodore shouted. We're here for a will reading, not a concert. It's legally binding, Gerald said firmly. These instructions are part of the execution of the will. If you want to move forward with anything, this must happen first. Patricia shook her head. This is just another manipulation. She probably practiced this piece for months knowing it was in the will. But Benjamin said quietly, she couldn't have known. None of us knew about this letter. Eleanor walked slowly to the piano. Her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. She hadn't played since Richard died. She hadn't even thought about music. And now she was supposed to play the most difficult piece she knew, the one Richard used to ask her to play late at night when he couldn't sleep, in front of people who hated her. She pulled the sheet off the piano and sat down on the bench. The keys stared back at her, white and black, familiar and terrifying at the same time. The room behind her was silent now, waiting. Eleanor placed her shaking hands on the keys. She closed her eyes and thought of Richard. She thought of the first night she played this piece for him, how he had cried and told her it was like having Catherine back for just a moment. She thought of all the nights after that, when he would sit beside her on the bench and turn the pages of her sheet music. Then she began to play, and everything else disappeared. The first notes filled the study like drops of water in a silent cave. Eleanor's fingers moved across the keys, tentative at first, then growing stronger. The opening melody of Chopin's Ballade was soft and questioning, like someone trying to remember something beautiful from long ago. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. When Eleanor played, she became someone else. The grief, the fear, the anger in the room, it all faded away. There was only the music and the memories it carried. She had played this piece dozens of times for Richard. He would sit in his favorite chair with his eyes closed, and sometimes tears would run down his cheeks. He told her once that when Eleanor played, he could feel Catherine's presence in the room. Not in a sad way, but in a way that made him grateful for having loved deeply twice in one lifetime. The music built slowly, the way Chopin intended. Each phrase led into the next like waves rolling onto shore. Eleanor's whole body moved with the rhythm. She swayed gently, her shoulders rising and falling, completely lost in the performance. In the audience, something was changing. Patricia had been ready to storm out, to call her lawyers the moment this ridiculous performance ended. But as the music filled the room, she found herself frozen in her seat. This wasn't just someone playing notes on a piano. This was something else entirely. She remembered her mother playing this exact piece 30 years ago at a charity concert. Patricia had been 9 years old, sitting in the front row with her brothers, watching her mother's hands fly across the keys. Back then, she thought her mother was magic. The memory hit Patricia so hard she had to grip the armrest of her chair. Benjamin was crying. He didn't even try to hide it. He remembered coming home from college after his mother died. The piano had sat silent in this study for months. His father couldn't bear to hear it played. Benjamin had tried once to play something simple, and his father had asked him to stop. The silence of that piano had been one of the saddest things about losing their mother. But now it was singing again, and somehow that felt like a small piece of healing. Even Theodore's expression had changed. His jaw was still set, his arms still crossed, but his eyes were different. He was watching Eleanor's face, seeing something there he hadn't expected to see. Real grief. Deep, genuine sorrow that matched his own. The music shifted into the middle section, darker and more turbulent. Eleanor's fingers attacked the keys now, the peaceful melody replaced by something urgent and painful. This was the part where Chopin wrote about loss, about things that could never be recovered. Eleanor played it like her heart was breaking all over again, because it was. Every note reminded her of Richard, the way he would hum along softly, the way he would reach over and squeeze her hand during the quiet parts, the way he told her that she played with her soul, not just her fingers. She was playing for him now, one last time, and she put everything she had into it. The technical difficulty of the piece was extraordinary. There were runs that required perfect precision, jumps that needed split-second timing, and a complexity that took years to master. Eleanor played it flawlessly, but that wasn't what held everyone's attention. It was the emotion, the raw, unfiltered feeling that poured out with every chord. Gerald Pemberton watched the family as much as he watched Eleanor. He had known Richard's plan would work. Richard had told him they need to see her, really see her. Not the young woman who married their old father. Not the stranger who came into our lives. They need to see the person I fell in love with. The music built to its first climax, loud and powerful, then suddenly dropped to almost a whisper. Eleanor's hands barely touched the keys now, coaxing out notes so soft they were almost imaginary. The contrast was stunning. It was like watching a storm pass and leave behind perfect stillness. Patricia felt something break inside her chest. She had hated Eleanor for 8 months without ever really meeting her. She had refused to attend the wedding, refused to speak to her father as long as he was with that woman. And now, watching this performance, Patricia realized something terrible. Her mother would have liked Eleanor. Catherine would have seen the musical soul, the gentle kindness, the way Eleanor brought joy back into Richard's eyes. The thought made Patricia feel sick with shame. The music moved into the final section, the part that always destroyed Eleanor emotionally. It was the resolution, but not a happy one. It was acceptance. It was the acknowledgement that beautiful things end, that people leave, that all we can do is hold on to the love while we have it. Eleanor's vision blurred with tears, but she didn't stop playing. She couldn't stop. This was her goodbye to Richard, the husband she barely got to have. This was her way of telling him she understood why he left her the estate, why he set up this moment, why he needed his children to see this. He was trying to build a bridge between her and them, even from beyond the grave. The final notes approached. The piece ended with a flourish, a cascade of notes that required every bit of skill and control Eleanor possessed. Her hands flew across the keys, her whole body leaning into the music. Then with one last powerful chord, it was over. The silence that followed was deafening. Eleanor kept her hands on the keys, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She couldn't look at anyone. She had just poured her entire heart out in front of people who thought she was a liar and a thief. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound in the room was Eleanor's quiet crying. Finally, Benjamin stood up. His face was wet with tears. He walked slowly to the piano and stood beside Eleanor. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then he said very quietly, "I'm sorry." Those two words broke something open in the room. Patricia put her face in her hands and started crying too. Not angry tears this time, but tears of grief and regret and confusion. She had been so sure about Eleanor, so absolutely certain. But you can't fake what they had just witnessed. You can't pretend that kind of emotion. Theodore remained in his seat, but his face had changed completely. He looked lost, like someone who had just realized they made a terrible mistake but didn't know how to fix it. Gerald stood up and walked to his desk. He picked up another envelope, this one smaller than the first. "Richard wanted me to give you this now, Eleanor. Before I continue with the rest of the will." Eleanor finally looked up. Her face was streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. She took the envelope with trembling hands and carefully opened it. Inside was a single piece of paper with Richard's handwriting. She read it silently, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Then, with a shaking voice, she read it aloud so everyone could hear. "My dearest Eleanor, if you're reading this, you've just played for my children, and you've done it beautifully. I know you're scared right now. I know they've been cruel to you. But this is where everything changes. What I'm about to reveal will shock them, but more importantly, it will show them the truth about your character. Trust me, my love. Trust the plan. You are stronger than you know, and your heart is pure. They will see that now." "All my love, Richard." Theodore stood up. He walked to where Benjamin stood by the piano. The two brothers looked at each other, then at Patricia, who had also risen from her seat. Something unspoken passed between them. Gerald cleared his throat. "What Richard wrote in that note is true. There is more to reveal. Things that will change how you see everything." He pulled out yet another document from his folder. "But first, I need to show you something that Richard asked Eleanor to sign before they were married. Something he deliberately kept from all of you until this moment." He held up the document so everyone could see the official letterhead. "This is a prenuptial agreement signed by Eleanor 3 days before the wedding." Theodore's eyes narrowed. "What does it say?" Gerald read from the document. "In the event that Richard Joseph Ashford passes away within the first 5 years of marriage, Eleanor Chen Ashford agrees to accept only $100,000 from the estate and waives all rights to any properties, businesses, or additional assets." The room went completely silent again. Patricia's mouth fell open. "She signed that?" "Without hesitation," Gerald confirmed. "Richard told me she actually asked him to make it even less. She suggested $50,000. Richard refused and settled on $100,000. Benjamin looked at Eleanor with new eyes. "You signed away everything before you even married him?" Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. Her voice was completely gone from crying. Theodore sat back down heavily in his chair. "I don't understand. If she signed that, then why does the will say she gets the Hampton estate?" Gerald smiled slightly. It was a sad smile, but there was something knowing in it too. "That's the question, isn't it? Why would Richard leave everything to someone who had already agreed to take almost nothing?" He pulled out the largest envelope yet. "This is where Richard's real plan begins. You see, the will I read to you is accurate, but it's not complete. There's a second part, with instructions that couldn't be revealed until after Eleanor played the piano and until you saw the prenuptial agreement." Patricia wiped her eyes. "What kind of instructions?" "The kind that will change everything you think you know," Gerald said. He looked at each of them in turn. "The Hampton estate and the art collection are not actually going to Eleanor." "Not in the way you think." Eleanor's head snapped up. "What?" Gerald's expression was gentle as he looked at her. "You didn't know either, did you? Richard kept this part secret from everyone, even you." Eleanor shook her head, completely confused. She had assumed Richard left her those things because he wanted her to be secure after he died. But now Gerald was saying something different. Theodore leaned forward. "Then where is it going?" Gerald opened the large envelope and pulled out a thick stack of papers. Richard established a foundation, the Catherine Ashford Memorial Foundation for Music Education. The Hampton estate will house the foundation. The art collection will be sold, and the proceeds will fund music scholarships for underprivileged children. The foundation's mission is to ensure that talented young people, regardless of their economic background, have access to music education. The room was so quiet you could hear people breathing. Gerald continued. And the director of this foundation, serving without salary but with full authority over how the money is spent and how the programs are run, is Eleanor Chen Ashford, Patricia whispered. A foundation in our mother's name. Your father spent the last 3 months of his life planning this with Eleanor, Gerald said. She knew about it. She helped design the programs. She even picked out which pieces of art should be sold first. She was completely on board with all of it. Benjamin looked at Eleanor. You knew you weren't really getting the estate. Eleanor finally found her voice. It was hoarse and broken, but the words came. Richard wanted to do something meaningful, something that would honor Catherine's memory and help children like I used to be. Kids who love music but whose families can't afford lessons or instruments. He asked me to help him plan it, and I said yes immediately. I never wanted his money. I just wanted him. Theodore stood up again. He walked over to Eleanor, and for a moment she thought he might yell at her again. But instead, he did something that shocked everyone in the room. He held out his hand to her. I owe you an apology, he said, his voice rough with emotion. A big one. Eleanor stared at Theodore's outstretched hand. Just 30 minutes ago, this man had called her a con artist. He had accused her of manipulating his father. And now he stood before her, hand extended, waiting for her to accept his apology. She hesitated. Part of her wanted to take his hand. Part of her wanted to push it away and tell him how much his words had hurt. But mostly she was just exhausted. Exhausted from grief, from defending herself, from trying to prove she was worthy of Richard's love. Slowly, she reached out and shook Theodore's hand. His grip was firm but gentle, nothing like the angry man from earlier. When she looked up at his face, she saw tears in his eyes. I don't know what to say, Theodore said. I've spent 8 months hating you. I convinced myself you were using my father. I refused to see him because I couldn't stand to watch him make what I thought was the biggest mistake of his life. His voice cracked. And now I realized the mistake was mine. Patricia stood up and walked over to them. Her designer heels clicked on the hardwood floor. She stopped right in front of Eleanor, and for a moment her expression was unreadable. Then she did something Eleanor never expected. She pulled Eleanor into a tight embrace. I'm so sorry, Patricia whispered. I was horrible to you. I said terrible things. I wouldn't even give you a chance. She pulled back, holding Eleanor by the shoulders. My mother would be so disappointed in me right now. She always taught us to see people's hearts, not their circumstances, and I forgot that lesson completely. Eleanor couldn't hold it together anymore. She had been trying so hard to stay strong, to keep her dignity in front of these people who had judged her so harshly. But Patricia's embrace broke through all her defenses. She sobbed, and Patricia held her, crying too. Benjamin joined them, putting a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. Dad was happy with you. I didn't want to see it, but he was. He called me about a month before he died. I didn't answer. He left a voicemail saying he wanted me to meet you, that you reminded him of Mom in the best ways. I deleted it without really listening. He wiped his eyes roughly. I'd give anything to have that voicemail back now. Gerald watched all of this with tears in his own eyes. He had known Richard for 40 years, had drawn up his first will, had been there through the death of Catherine and the birth of each grandchild. This moment right here was what Richard had wanted. Not division, not fighting, but understanding. There's more you should know, Gerald said gently. Richard left letters for each of you. Individual letters that explain his feelings, his hopes, and his regrets. He wanted me to give them to you after this moment, after you understood the truth about Eleanor. He handed each of them an envelope with their name written in Richard's distinctive handwriting. Theodore, Patricia, and Benjamin took them with trembling hands. These were their father's final words to them, and suddenly the weight of what they had lost hit all over again. Should we read them now? Benjamin asked. Gerald shook his head. Richard suggested you read them in private. They're deeply personal. But there's one more thing he wanted me to share with all of you together. He pulled out a small memory card from his pocket. Richard recorded a video message. He made it 2 weeks before his trip to New York. He had a feeling his time was short. His doctor had warned him his heart was weaker than expected. Gerald walked to the laptop on Richard's desk and inserted the memory card. He wanted you all to see this together. The large monitor on the wall flickered to life, and there was Richard, sitting in his favorite chair in this very study, looking directly at the camera. He looked tired but peaceful, happy even. Hello, my loves. Richard's voice filled the room. Everyone froze. Hearing his voice again was like a punch to the chest. If you're watching this, I'm gone. And knowing my children, you've probably just spent the last hour being terrible to Eleanor. Theodore let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. Their father knew them so well. Richard continued. I hope Gerald has shown you by now that Eleanor is not who you thought she was. I hope you've seen her play the piano, seen her heart, understood that she loved me for me. But I want to tell you something else. Something I should have told you while I was alive, but I was too proud. He paused, collecting his thoughts. After your mother died, I was lost. You all had your own lives, your own families, your own problems. I never wanted to burden you with my loneliness, so I hid it. I pretended I was fine. I threw myself into work and told myself that was enough. Patricia was crying silently, her hand over her mouth. But it wasn't enough, Richard said. I was dying inside. Not physically, not yet, but emotionally. I went through the motions of living without really being alive. And then I met Eleanor at that charity event. She was playing Chopin, and for the first time in 5 years I felt something other than emptiness. He smiled at the camera. She didn't know who I was at first. When I told her my name, she didn't act impressed or interested in my money. She just wanted to talk about music. We spent an hour discussing Chopin and Beethoven and why Mozart makes people cry. It was the best conversation I'd had in years. Benjamin sat down heavily in his chair, his eyes fixed on the screen. I know the age difference bothered you, Richard went on. It bothered me too at first. I thought, what could this young, talented woman possibly want with an old man like me? But Eleanor never saw my age. She saw me. She laughed at my terrible jokes. She made me try new foods. She got me to walk in the rain and visit bookstores and do all the little things that make life worth living. Richard's expression grew more serious. I'm not leaving her the estate because I'm being manipulated or because I've lost my mind. I'm leaving it to her because I want my final act on this earth to mean something. The foundation we're creating will help hundreds, maybe thousands of children discover the joy of music. Children who might never get that chance otherwise. He looked directly into the camera with an intensity that made everyone feel like he was speaking to them personally. Eleanor could have married me and done nothing. She could have waited for me to die and taken whatever I left her and lived a comfortable life. But that's not who she is. When I told her about my idea for the foundation, she cried. Then she spent the next 3 months working with me every single day to make it perfect. Theodore closed his eyes, processing everything. She researched music programs in underserved communities, Richard continued. She reached out to music teachers to understand what resources they needed most. She helped me decide which pieces of art to sell and which to keep. She did all of this knowing she would get nothing out of it except the satisfaction of helping others. That's who you've been treating like a criminal. The room was completely silent except for Richard's voice and occasional sniffles from his children. I'm asking you to do something for me, Richard said, his voice softer now. I'm asking you to let go of your anger and your suspicion. I'm asking you to get to know Eleanor the way I did. Not as the woman who married your father. Not as an outsider. But as family? Patricia let out a small sob at that word. Family? She's brilliant and kind and talented. She made me laugh every single day. She reminded me what it felt like to be loved. Not for what I could provide, but for who I was. Richard's eyes grew shiny with tears. And more than anything, I want you to support her as she runs this foundation. She's going to need help. She's going to need guidance. She's going to need people who believe in what she's trying to do. He looked at each of them through the camera, as if he could see them. Theodore, you have the business experience to help manage the foundation's finances. Patricia, you have the social connections to help raise awareness and funding. Benjamin, you have the creativity and passion to help design programs that really reach kids. Richard smiled. I'm giving you all a chance to be part of something bigger than family disagreements or hurt feelings. I'm giving you a chance to honor your mother's memory in a meaningful way. Please don't waste it. The video showed Richard sitting back in his chair, looking tired but content. I love you all more than you'll ever know. I'm sorry I wasn't a better father in my final years. I'm sorry I let my loneliness drive a wedge between us. But I'm not sorry for marrying Eleanor. She was the best thing that happened to me in the last chapter of my life. He looked directly at the camera one last time. Take care of each other. Be kind to Eleanor. And remember that love doesn't follow rules or timelines or expectations. It just is. Goodbye, my dear ones. The screen went black. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The weight of Richard's words hung in the air like a living thing. Eleanor sat at the piano bench, tears streaming down her face. The three siblings stood or sat in various positions around the room, each lost in their own grief and regret. Finally, Benjamin walked over to Eleanor. He knelt down beside the piano bench so he could look up at her face. "Tell me about him. Tell me about my dad in those last 8 months." "I want to know everything." Eleanor wiped her eyes and tried to compose herself. "He talked about you all the time. All three of you. He was so proud of you. But we weren't there for him," Benjamin said, his voice breaking. "He understood," Eleanor said softly. "He never blamed you. He just missed you." She looked at all three of them. "He showed me photo albums. He told me stories about when you were kids. Patricia, he said you were the bravest person he knew. Theodore, he said you had his mind for business but your mother's heart. Benjamin, he said you were the most creative soul in the family." Patricia walked over to join them. "What did he do all day?" "After he retired?" "He read a lot," Eleanor said. "He was working his way through all the books he never had time for. He liked to walk in the park near my apartment. He fed the ducks, which he said was silly but made him happy. He took up painting for a while, though he said he was terrible at it." She smiled through her tears. "He wasn't terrible. He just had high standards." Theodore came over too, completing the circle around the piano. "Did he know that his heart was getting worse?" Eleanor nodded. "The doctor told him 3 months ago. Said he probably had less than a year, maybe only a few months. That's when we really started working hard on the foundation. He wanted to make sure everything was planned out perfectly." "And he never told us," Patricia said quietly. "He didn't want you to worry," Eleanor said. "He said you all had enough stress in your lives. He wanted his last months to be about creating something good, not about being sick." Theodore sat down on the floor, right there in his expensive suit, and put his head in his hands. "We failed him." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "He didn't see it that way. He told me once that the best thing about being a parent is watching your children build their own lives. He said it meant he did his job right. He was lonely sometimes, yes, but he wasn't bitter. He was grateful for the time he had." Benjamin looked up at her. "How did you do it? How did you handle everyone judging you?" "We were so cruel." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I knew the truth. I knew what Richard and I had, and I knew that eventually, somehow, the truth would matter more than the accusations. I just had to wait for the right moment." She gestured to the piano. "I guess this was that moment." Patricia reached out and took Eleanor's hand. "Will you forgive us? I know it's a lot to ask after everything we said and did." Eleanor looked at Richard's daughter, really looked at her, and saw genuine remorse there. She saw the same eyes Richard had, the same determined set of the jaw. She saw family. "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "Richard would want that. So yes, I forgive you." 6 months had passed since that day in Richard's study. 6 months since the will reading that changed everything. Eleanor still thought about that afternoon sometimes, how it felt to play the piano while Richard's children watched with hatred in their eyes. How that hatred had slowly transformed into understanding, then remorse, and finally into something that felt like the beginning of family. The Hampton estate looked different now. Workers had spent months renovating parts of it, turning the east wing into offices and practice rooms. The grand ballroom had been converted into a performance space where students could give recitals. The gardens were still beautiful, but now they were filled with the sounds of children laughing and music drifting through open windows. Eleanor stood in what used to be the library, now transformed into the main administrative office of the Catherine Ashford Memorial Foundation. She was reviewing scholarship applications when Patricia walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use this," Patricia said, handing her a cup. "You've been at this for 3 hours straight." Eleanor smiled and accepted the coffee gratefully. "There are so many applications. Every single one of these kids deserves a chance." Patricia sat down across from her. She came to the foundation office twice a week now, helping with fundraising and outreach. It had been awkward at first, both of them trying to figure out how to be around each other. But slowly, carefully, they had built something real. "We'll help as many as we can," Patricia said. "That's what matters. Mom would be proud of what you're doing here." Eleanor felt the familiar sting of tears but blinked them back. She cried less now than she had in those first terrible months after Richard died. The grief was still there, always would be, but it had transformed into something she could carry without it crushing her. "I found something yesterday," Eleanor said, reaching into her desk drawer. She pulled out an old photograph. It was in one of the boxes from Richard's study. I thought you might want it. Patricia took the photo. It showed a younger version of Richard and Catherine at the piano together, both of them laughing at something. Catherine's hands were on the keys and Richard was leaning over her shoulder. They looked so happy, so alive. I've never seen this one, Patricia whispered. Look how young they were. Early 30s, I think, Eleanor said. There was a date on the back. 1989. Patricia stared at the photo for a long moment. You know what's strange? I used to hate when people said you reminded them of my mother. It felt like you were trying to replace her. But now I understand what they meant. It's not that you're like her. It's that you loved music the same way she did. You both saw it as something sacred, something worth dedicating your life to. Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest. That means everything to me. Thank you. The door opened and Benjamin walked in with a young girl who looked about 10 years old. She was clutching a violin case and looked nervous. Eleanor, this is Maya Rodriguez, Benjamin said. She's one of our new scholarship recipients. She wanted to meet you before her first lesson. Eleanor stood up and walked over to the girl. She knelt down so they were at eye level. Hi, Maya, I hear you're going to be learning violin. Maya nodded shyly. My mom says I'm lucky. She says this foundation is a miracle. You're the miracle, Eleanor said gently. You're the reason we do this. Are you excited to start lessons? Really excited, Maya said, her face breaking into a huge smile. I've wanted to play violin since I was little, but we couldn't afford it. My teacher at school said I have natural rhythm. Then you're going to do amazing things, Eleanor said. She glanced at Benjamin. Is her teacher here? Just arrived, Benjamin confirmed. Mr. Chen is setting up in practice room 3. Eleanor turned back to Maya. You go have a wonderful first lesson. And if you ever need anything, you come find me, okay? I'm here 3 days a week. Maya threw her arms around Eleanor in an impulsive hug, then blushed and pulled away. Thank you. Thank you so much. She hurried off toward the practice rooms, her violin case bouncing against her leg. Benjamin watched her go with a smile. That never gets old. Seeing their faces when they realize they actually get to learn music? It's the best part, Eleanor agreed. She had been worried about running the foundation, worried she wouldn't be good enough or smart enough. But this part, connecting with the students, this came naturally. Patricia stood up. I need to head out. I have a meeting with the symphony about partnering with us for the spring showcase. But before I go, I wanted to remind you about Sunday dinner. I'll be there, Eleanor promised. Patricia hugged her, something that still felt a bit surreal, but also completely right. The kids are excited to see you. My daughter wants you to hear the piece she's been working on. After Patricia left, Benjamin settled into the chair she'd vacated. How are you really doing? He asked. And don't give me the polite answer. I want the truth. Eleanor set down her coffee and considered the question. Some days are harder than others. I still reach for the phone sometimes to call him. I'll see something funny and think Richard would love this before I remember he's not here. I do the same thing, Benjamin admitted. Last week I was reading a book about Roman history, and I picked up my phone to tell Dad about it. We used to talk about history all the time when I was younger. Then after Mom died, I just stopped calling. I thought I was giving him space, but really I was just avoiding my own pain. He knew you loved him, Eleanor said softly. Because you told him that, Benjamin replied. I found another letter he wrote. It was in the book I mentioned to you, the one from his nightstand. He wrote about how you always reminded him that his kids loved him, even when we weren't great at showing it. Eleanor felt her eyes getting wet again. I meant every word. You all were his whole world. And now you're part of that world, Benjamin said. I know it's not the same as having him here. Nothing will ever be the same. But you're family now, Eleanor. Real family. The word hung in the air between them, family. 6 months ago it seemed impossible. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Theodore arrived an hour later with his wife, bringing lunch for everyone. This had become their routine. Once a week, all 3 siblings came to the foundation to help out and to spend time with Eleanor. They were learning about each other, filling in the gaps that Richard had left behind. They ate together in the garden, the same garden where Richard used to walk every morning. Theodore shared updates about Ashford Industries. Patricia talked about her fundraising goals. Benjamin showed everyone photos of the mural that students had painted in the main hallway. Eleanor listened and laughed and contributed her own stories. This was what healing looked like. Not forgetting Richard or pretending the pain didn't exist, but learning to carry the love and the loss together, letting it transform into something that could help others. After lunch, Eleanor gave them a tour of the newly completed music library. Hundreds of books and sheet music, all cataloged and available to students. In the center of the room was a display case with a photo of Richard and Catherine together, along with one of Richard's favorite quotes about music engraved on a plaque. Music gives a soul to the universe, wings to the mind, flight to the imagination, and life to everything, Theodore read aloud. Plato. Dad loved that quote, Patricia said. He had it hanging in his first office. He quoted it to me on our second date, Eleanor added. He said it was how he knew Catherine was the one. She understood that music wasn't just entertainment. It was essential to being human. They stood together, the four of them, looking at Richard's face in the photograph. He looked so proud in that picture, standing next to Catherine at some formal event. Eleanor wondered if he had any idea back then how his life would unfold. If he knew he'd lose Catherine too soon, find love again late in life, and create something that would outlive them both. He'd be proud of this. Theodore said finally, of what you've built here, what we're all building together. We're just getting started, Eleanor said. We've helped 50 students so far, but there are thousands more who need this opportunity. Kids who have talent and passion but no resources. Then we'll find a way to reach them, Patricia said with determination. We'll expand the fundraising, bring in more donors, maybe even open satellite locations in other cities. We have the business model for it, Theodore added. The foundation is financially stable. Dad made sure of that. We can grow this as big as it needs to be. Benjamin pulled out his phone. I've been working on a documentary about the foundation. Short clips showing the students, their progress, their stories. We could use it for awareness and fundraising. Eleanor looked at them. These three people who had hated her 6 months ago, now they were her partners, her friends, her family. They were united by grief and love and a shared mission to honor Richard and Catherine's memory. A student walked by practicing scales on a flute, the notes floating through the air. Another sat in the garden with a guitar, working through chords. In a practice room somewhere upstairs, a piano played, the sound echoing through the halls. Richard's house, once so quiet and empty, was full of music again. That evening, Eleanor returned to her apartment in Seattle. She hadn't moved into the mansion. It didn't feel right. The foundation needed to be in that space, needed to fill it with life and purpose. She preferred her small apartment with its view of the city and her own piano by the window. She made tea and sat down at her piano. Her fingers found the keys and she began to play Chopin's Ballade in G minor. The piece that had changed everything. The piece that had shown Richard's children who she really was. But this time she didn't cry. This time she played it with gratitude. For the 8 months she had with Richard. For the family she'd found in the most unexpected way. For the chance to help children discover the joy of music. For all of it. The pain and the beauty mixed together. She played the final notes and sat in the silence that followed. Then she smiled. The first real smile she'd felt in weeks. Thank you, Richard, she whispered to the empty room. For everything. Somewhere, somehow, she felt like he heard her. And she knew with absolute certainty that he was proud. Not of what she'd inherited or what she'd been given, but of what she'd chosen to do with it. She had taken his final gift and transformed it into something that would touch countless lives. That was love's true legacy. Not money or property or possessions, but the ripple effect of kindness spreading out in waves, reaching people who would never even know Richard's name, but would benefit from his generosity and Eleanor's dedication. Eleanor closed the piano and turned off the lights. Tomorrow she would return to the foundation. There were more applications to review, more students to meet, more music to be made. The work would never be finished, and that was exactly how it should be. She had been called a gold digger, accused of marrying for money, treated like an outsider. But in the end, she had proven that love couldn't be measured in dollars or calculated in inheritance. It was measured in moments, in sacrifice, in choosing others over yourself, and that was a wealth that could never be taken away. The end.